scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything appeared normal. Peppa stretched and yawned, looking over at George, who was still sleeping peacefully in the bottom bunk. But something felt different today. As Peppa climbed down from her bed, she noticed that her reflection in the bedroom mirror seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. She stopped and stared at the mirror, but her reflection appeared perfectly normal now. George stirred and opened his eyes, but when he looked at Peppa, his usual cheerful expression was replaced by something else entirely. George's eyes had changed. They were still the same size and shape, but they seemed darker somehow, as if shadows had crept into them during the night. When he smiled at Peppa, his grin stretched just a little too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Her back was turned to the children as they entered, and she was humming a tune that Peppa had never heard before. The melody was strange and unsettling. When Mummy Pig turned around, her smile was as warm as always, but her eyes had the same dark quality that Peppa had noticed in George. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper at the breakfast table, but the pages were completely blank. He turned each empty page with great interest, occasionally chuckling at invisible jokes. When Peppa pointed this out, Daddy Pig looked at her with confusion and insisted that he was reading the most fascinating article. The house itself began to feel different as the morning progressed. Rooms seemed to be in slightly different places than they were the day before. The hallway appeared longer, and doors that Peppa was certain led to familiar rooms now opened onto spaces she had never seen before. One door revealed a room filled entirely with mirrors, each one showing a slightly different version of whoever looked into them. By afternoon, more friends had arrived to play, but they too had changed. Susie Sheepswool had turned a shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The playground where they usually played had transformed overnight. The swings moved by themselves in the still air, creaking with a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered words. As evening approached, the changes became more pronounced. The sun set in the wrong direction, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. The familiar yellow house on the hill had developed extra windows that glowed with an inner light. When bedtime arrived, Peppa and George climbed into their beds as usual, but sleep would not come easily. The house creaked and settled around them, but the sounds were different now, more deliberate. The last thing Peppa remembered before finally drifting off to sleep was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their room. These weren't the familiar footsteps of Mummy or Daddy Pig. These steps were lighter, more numerous, as if many small feet were walking back and forth throughout the night.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa noticed something strange about her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The reflection smiled back at her, but Peppa wasn't smiling. She blinked, and for a moment the reflection didn't blink back. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the living room when he heard whispers coming from the walls. The whispers spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they were calling his name. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner in the kitchen when all the family photos on the wall began to change. In each picture, the family's smiles became wider and wider, stretching beyond what should be possible. Their eyes grew darker, like empty holes staring back at her. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in his favorite chair when the words on the pages started rearranging themselves, spelling out messages that made no sense, yet filled him with inexplicable dread. That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear footsteps in the hallway. But when she looked, no one was there. The footsteps were small, like a child's, but they moved in a rhythm that didn't match any normal walking pattern. George's room was across the hall, and she could see his door was slightly open. Through the crack, she glimpsed something moving in the darkness that was too tall to be George. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast, but something was wrong with their shadows. While they sat at the table eating, their shadows on the wall were standing up, moving independently, reaching toward each other with elongated arms. Peppa tried to tell her parents, but when she spoke, her voice came out as someone else's whisper. At playgroup, Susie Sheep noticed that Peppa's eyes had changed color overnight. They were still brown, but there was something else behind them, something that watched and waited. During playtime, all the toys in the room began moving on their own, arranging themselves in perfect circles around the children. The teacher, Madame Gazelle, smiled her usual smile, but her reflection in the window showed something entirely different. When the family returned home that evening, they found that their house had gained an extra room. A door that had never been there before stood at the end of the upstairs hallway. Behind the door, they could hear the sound of children playing, but the voices didn't belong to Peppa or George. The voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like them, but spoke words they had never said. As night fell, the pig family realized they were no longer alone in their house. There were others now, others who looked just like them, but weren't quite right. These others lived in the mirrors, in the shadows, in the spaces between the walls. And slowly, very slowly, they were beginning to take over, one reflection at a time.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, Peppa noticed her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late, as if it was trying to catch up with her movements. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like two dark holes in her face. Yet Mummy Pig continued cooking as if nothing had changed, her movements mechanical and precise. George was sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his toy dinosaur as usual. Instead, he was staring directly at Peppa with an unsettling grin that stretched far too wide across his face. His teeth, normally small and harmless, had become sharp and pointed like tiny daggers. The family car ride to playgroup felt endless. Daddy Pig drove in complete silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Through the car windows, Peppa could see that all the other houses in their neighborhood had their curtains drawn shut, and no other cars were on the road. When they arrived at the playgroup, the building looked exactly the same from the outside, but something was terribly wrong. The playground was empty, and the swings moved back and forth in the windless air as if invisible children were playing on them. The slide that was usually bright yellow had faded to a sickly pale color. Inside the classroom, all of Peppa's friends were already seated in a perfect circle. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, and all the others sat motionless with their backs straight and their hands folded neatly in their laps. Their eyes had the same black emptiness that Peppa had seen in Mummy Pig's face. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom, but her usual warm smile had been replaced by something cold and calculating. When she spoke, her voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. She announced that today they would be playing a very special game, one that had never been played before. The game was simple, Madame Gazelle explained. Each child would take turns standing in the center of the circle while the others watched in complete silence. But as each friend took their turn, something horrible happened. They would stand up normally, but then their bodies would begin to change, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. Peppa watched in horror as Susie Sheep's wool began to fall out in clumps, revealing gray, mottled skin underneath. Rebecca Rabbit's ears grew longer and longer until they dragged on the floor behind her. Pedro Pony's mane turned from brown to black and began to move like it was alive, writhing and reaching toward the other children. When it was finally Peppa's turn to stand in the center, she felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through her body. She looked down at her hands and saw that her pink skin was becoming translucent, and she could see dark veins pulsing underneath. Her red dress began to change color, shifting from bright red to deep crimson to black. The other children began to chant in unison, their voices creating a low, hypnotic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the classroom. The words they spoke were in no language Peppa had ever heard, but somehow she understood their meaning. They were calling to something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for a very long time. As the chanting grew louder, the classroom began to change around them. The cheerful yellow walls darkened to a deep purple, and the windows became black as night. The toys and books that lined the shelves began to move on their own, rearranging themselves into strange patterns and symbols. Peppa tried to run toward the door, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. She was trapped in the center of the circle, unable to move as the transformation continued. Her reflection in the classroom mirror showed something that was no longer quite Peppa, but something else entirely, something with too many teeth and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. The episode ended with Peppa's family driving home in the same eerie silence. But now Peppa sat in the back seat with the same black eyes and mechanical movements as the rest of her family. The car passed by other houses where other families were returning from their own strange days. All of them changed, all of them part of something larger and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. As they pulled into their driveway, Peppa looked up at her bedroom window and saw another version of herself looking back down, the version that had never left the house, the version that was still normal. But as she watched, that other Peppa slowly raised her hand and waved goodbye before the curtains closed forever. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George were getting ready for bed. Mummy Pig had just finished reading them their favorite bedtime story, and Daddy Pig was downstairs watching television. The house felt warm and cozy, with the familiar yellow walls glowing softly in the lamplight. Everything seemed normal, just like any other night in the Pig family home. But as soon as the lights went out, something changed. Peppa noticed that her bedroom felt different somehow. The shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift, even though there was no wind. George's breathing sounded strange from his bed across the room, almost like he was whispering something in his sleep. When Peppa tried to listen more carefully, she realized the whispers weren't coming from George at all. The whispers were coming from inside the walls themselves. They started as a soft murmur, barely audible, but gradually grew louder and more distinct. The voices seemed to be calling her name over and over again, in a sing-song melody that made her skin crawl. Peppa pulled her blanket over her head, but the voices only grew stronger, seeping through the fabric like cold air. Suddenly, George sat up in his bed. But when he turned to look at Peppa, his eyes were completely black, like two empty holes in his face. His usual cheerful smile had been replaced by something much wider and more unsettling. When he spoke, his voice sounded wrong, deeper and echoing as if it was coming from somewhere far away. He told Peppa that the house wanted to play a special game with them tonight. The bedroom door creaked open by itself, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The familiar family photos on the walls had changed. In each picture, the faces of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were twisted into expressions of terror, their eyes following Peppa as she moved. The floorboards groaned under invisible footsteps, and the temperature in the house began to drop rapidly. George stood up and walked toward the door with jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He beckoned for Peppa to follow him downstairs. As they descended the staircase, each step echoed through the house with a hollow, metallic sound. The living room below was bathed in an eerie blue light that seemed to come from nowhere. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were sitting on the sofa, but they weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with those same black, empty eyes. When Peppa called out to them, they turned their heads in perfect unison, their necks making a horrible cracking sound. Their smiles were too wide, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The television was on, but instead of showing Daddy Pig's usual programs, it displayed images of the house itself, as if cameras were hidden in every room. Peppa could see herself and George on the screen, standing in the living room, but there were other figures in the background that weren't really there. Dark shapes that moved just at the edge of vision. The house began to change around them. The walls started to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. The furniture rearranged itself when no one was looking, and the windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but an endless black void. The family photos continued to change, showing scenes that had never happened, moments of fear and confusion that felt more real than memory. As the night wore on, Peppa realized that this wasn't just a bad dream. The house had become something else entirely, something that fed on the warmth and happiness of the family that lived within it. And now, it wanted to keep them forever, trapped in this twisted version of their home where nothing was quite as it should be, and morning would never come again.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy evening when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their attic. While playing hide-and-seek, George found an old wooden box covered in cobwebs. When they opened it together, they found old family photographs that looked exactly like theirs, but something was terribly wrong. In these photographs, their family looked the same, but their eyes were completely black, like empty holes. The house looked identical to theirs, but the windows were boarded up and the garden was dead. Most disturbing of all, there was an extra family member in every photo. A tall, thin figure standing behind them with a wide, unnatural smile. Peppa tried to show the photographs to Mummy Pig, but when she looked at them, they appeared completely normal. The same happened with Daddy Pig. Only Peppa and George could see the dark eyes and the mysterious figure lurking in the background. That night, Peppa heard strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. She woke George, and together they followed the sounds through the house. The scratching led them to the living room, where they discovered that all the family portraits on the walls had changed. Their faces in the pictures now had the same black, empty eyes. The scratching grew louder and seemed to be coming from behind the largest family portrait above the fireplace. As they watched in horror, the frame began to bulge outward. The glass cracked with a sharp sound that echoed through the silent house. Suddenly, a long, pale hand emerged from the portrait, followed by the tall figure from the photographs. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a broken puppet. Its smile was impossibly wide, and its black eyes seemed to absorb all the light in the room. The figure spoke in a voice that sounded like their own voices mixed together. It told them that it had been waiting in the photographs for so long, watching their family, and now it wanted to take their place. Every night, it would replace one family member in the photographs, and eventually, it would replace them in real life too. Peppa grabbed George's hand, and they ran upstairs, but when they reached their bedroom, they found that all their toys had changed. Their teddy bears now had the same black eyes, and their blocks had formed strange patterns on the floor that filled them with dread. The figure appeared in their doorway, its smile even wider than before. It began to change shape, sometimes looking like Mummy Pig, sometimes like Daddy Pig, but always with those terrible black eyes. It told them that soon, everyone would have black eyes. As the figure reached toward them, Peppa noticed that their own reflections in the bedroom mirror were beginning to change. Their eyes were slowly turning dark. The figure laughed and told them that soon they would join the family in the photographs, trapped forever behind the glass.